Bob. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's very nice to be here. I have to say, though, I thought this was just a phenomenon in the States that when people come to a talk, they create this demilitarized zone between the speaker and the audience. So I may leap up there in a little while and talk to you. I was told, Bob informed me that this will be a very diverse audience, so I understand there are people in here who are teachers and performers and psychologists and just an array of people. So I will try to gear this in a way that everyone is interested at some point in time. I want to tell you a little bit about myself before I start talking about the topics I'm going to talk about today, because it sort of explains how I ended up doing what I'm doing. My dad was 50 years old when I was born, and he was convinced that I was going to be very successful in life, which for my dad, who was born in 1905, that meant making a lot of money. So he was sure I was going to be an attorney. And actually, I applied when I was in high school to go to college. I got a scholarship to study pre-law at a very prominent school. Everyone's very happy about that. And about in April of my senior year in high school, I was having dinner with my parents, and I know where they were sitting. I can see the tablecloth. I even know what we were eating. And I bucked up my courage, and I said, Dad, I don't think I want to be a lawyer. And my dad kind of perked up because he's thinking surgeon, And he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I think I want to be a music teacher. And there was a long pause, and we passed vegetables for a long time. And then my father asked the question that he would ask. He said, well, Bob, what do music teachers make? And this will date me a little bit, but at the time, I said, Dad, they make $8,000 a year, which when you're 17 years old, that's a fortune. How could you even spend $8,000 a year? I thought it was the greatest thing in the world. And I spent the next several years convincing my father that I hadn't made a mistake because I loved music, I loved to play, I loved to sing, and I loved to teach. And that was my first job. I was in a very fortunate place in Atlanta where I taught high school orchestra and band and played drums in recording studios. It was a perfect balance in my life. But what I found was I was so curious about the way learning worked. Not only my own learning as a musician, but my students' learning. And I found that my focus of attention really wasn't on what I was doing to them and with them, but I was most interested in what was going on in their minds that led to their understanding or not understanding, or being able to do something I was trying to get them to do, or not being able to do it. And those kinds of questions made teaching a very interesting enterprise for me. When I finished my degree and started teaching in a university, one of the things that I quickly realized is that many teacher preparation programs, now looking at it from a different perspective, were mostly about how to teach. And by that I mean what teachers should do to and with students. What they weren't about as much was how learners learn, which is ever more interesting and ever more important if you're going to be an effective teacher teaching a wide diversity of learners. There are a lot of prescriptive things that happen in education. And in the United States now, much of learning in schools, not just in music, but in all disciplines, is becoming even more highly prescriptive as we're preparing people to do well on standardized tests. But the thing that's interesting about that is it doesn't really acknowledge the fact that learners come to every experience with a history. And that history predicts what they're going to do when they respond to certain problems that we put before them and certain tasks that we ask them to do. And understanding that, to me, makes the whole enterprise of teaching a much more interesting and compelling one than just sort of going through the 9 steps of the clarinet embouchure to get somebody to do a particular thing. So that's what I want to talk about today. Before I talk anymore, since this is a music school, I'm going to play a little music. This video is about 2 minutes and 20 seconds long. You can adjust your attention spans accordingly. Many of you have probably seen this because it has now 63 million hits on YouTube, but I'll just let it play and then we'll talk after it's over. I have to make sure I turn on my clicker, though.
When
I would tell you how I found out about this video. One of my doctoral students sent me a link to this in an email and said, you got to see this video. Somebody locked a kid in a closet with a ukulele. It looked like he was in a closet, didn't it? Now, it's an interesting thing to watch this kid play. And I went and did a little research and found out who this kid is and how he learned to play the ukulele. Actually, he lives in Japan. And his father discovered that Japanese television was going to be playing a series of ukulele lessons for 3 months. And he went out and bought 2 ukuleles, one for himself and one for his son. And together, watching television, they learned to play the ukuleles together, and this is the result. Now, if I were going to adjudicate that performance, there are many flaws in what that child is doing. All of his strings don't vibrate with a clear tone. He loses tempo in the stop chorus when he's scratching his nose. And he doesn't know any of the words. He's Japanese. He's just making sounds that sound like English words. And there's a lot wrong with that. But I would argue to exhaustion with anyone who wanted to convince me that kid doesn't understand what music is for. And what I mean by that is conveying something to other human beings. Now, that's an important thing to think about, primarily because in school, one would think that's the focus of attention when people are teaching people about music. But often that's not the focus of attention when people are thinking about music. And one of the reasons that I play this video, not only because it just delights me, but also because it makes the case of how effective even very young people who have very little experience can express things to other human beings. And this is not something that, I mean, obviously this kid is a very capable kid and he's very good at what he does, but most kids who come to school in whatever discipline are much more capable than school gives them credit for being. I mean, everybody who comes to a new music experience as a learner has listened to countless hours of music since they were in utero, right? They've been listening to music, and they've been developing understandings about the way music in their culture works. And yet, we often bring them to school, and we put them in what's called beginning music instruction, right? Sort of ignoring the fact that they're not beginning listeners, right? They have a lot of understanding about music that's not a part of our planning for instruction. Now, the thing that's interesting to me about this is not unique to music making. I give a lot of talks for audiences in other disciplines, and what I find is often the things that exist outside of school, that is the reasons people make music, the reason people do experiments, the reason people write, whatever it happens to be, are often not present in the learning experiences in school. And one of the reasons that I think this is such an important thing to think about in any domain is that what we'd like to imagine is that at every point in learning to do whatever the skill happens to be, the main reason for doing it is at the forefront of learners' thinking, right? But that's often not what we find when we watch children in school. And all of you have taken courses as undergraduates in, fill in the blank for non-music majors, and left those courses thinking, why in the world would anybody be teaching this? And I don't know what your least favorite learning experience was in your history. Mine was a 7th grade geography class, which I still remember not fondly. And what I didn't like about the class so much is that I really didn't learn anything that was very interesting. We were studying from this big, thick book that had geography in big letters across the cover. And this nice, old, gentle man who was teaching this course would kind of drag us through this subject matter. And what I was learning was the principal exports of Chile and the altitude of Mount Everest and how many cattle there were on the cattle ranches in Florida. And that was geography. And I made it through that class. It was a happy thing. I left geography behind. And when I was a freshman and I went to college, I went to a freshman mixer thing where we were meeting up with various people who were from other majors and everything, and we're sort of have our little name tags on, and we're kind of drinking punch in the gym or wherever it was. And I'm talking to this guy, and he seems really interesting, and I'm having a good time talking to him. And I look down at his name tag, and the guy's a geography major. And I thought to myself, good God, who so misadvised you into this subject that is just bereft of anything interesting? There's a drop and add period. Maybe it's not too late. You could change your major. And of course, the more I talked to him, the more I realized I didn't understand anything about what geographers did in geography. Because again, what I knew about geography were the principal exports of Chile and the altitude of Mount Everest and so on, right? And so as he was telling me about this, I realized that my experiences in school in that subject matter were totally unlike experiences outside of school. And I would suggest to you that in music, that's also the case. That experiences that we create in school for learners in music are so utterly unlike the experiences that people have outside of school that it's not surprising then that many learners who come into school thinking they're going to do music end up feeling not very capable and not very interested in pursuing what we think is a very wonderful thing to pursue. I have a friend of mine in the neuroscience department in Texas who said if you ever put a slide up in a talk with a picture of a brain on it, people remember 30% more of your talk than if you didn't do that. I really think he just made that up, but I figured, you know. But the reason I put that there, I really do have a reason for that, is that when you imagine what we're doing when we're creating learning experiences, I mean, I would imagine that most of you, if not all of you in this room, realize that what we're trying to do is actually change that thing. But I want to suggest to you that many teachers' conceptions of human memory are mistaken. And many of you know that up until the middle of last century, many people's perceptions, and this still persists in many teachers' perceptions, is that brains are like tape recorders or like flash drives on computers. And when we're experiencing something, like all of you are experiencing something right now, stuff's getting written on the tape, and tomorrow you'll wake up and you think, well, I wonder what happened to that lecture at 4:30 yesterday. You rewind the tape to 4:30 and there's the lecture. And of course, that's not at all the case, as many of you well know. But the interesting thing about this is much of the learning experiences that we create for learners are predicated on that very idea. And you know, one example of it is what we're doing right now, right? I mean, most institutions of learning have rooms all over their campuses just like this, with chairs bolted to the floor, facing somebody, talking to you. And this is a terrible learning environment. And I can promise you, now that they've already cut my check, in the next hour, none of you is going to learn a damn thing from me, right? And the reason is you're not busy enough to be learning something, right? If any learning will take place, it won't happen in the room. The learning will take place after you leave this room. And if you happen to recall something that went on in this room and try to apply it in some way to something you're doing in the moment, that's when the learning will start. But this isn't the learning part, right? This is just listening to some guy talk, right? Now, the reason that's important to think about from a learning perspective is it challenges teachers, institutions, whatever the person, parents, whomever, right, to say what's really required to make that different. Because as, again, many of you know, when organic brains form memories, it's not like putting something on a flash drive. When you work with your computer, you hit the save command, your computer looks for a blank space on the drive, it writes whatever you're trying to save to the drive, and binary switches flip from 1 to 0 and 0 to 1 in some configuration that represents what you saved. What's already on the drive has no effect whatever of what you saved, right? Whatever you put on the drive subsequent to the thing you saved doesn't have any effect on what you saved. And organic brains don't work anything like that, right? I mean, all of you who are in the room right now are experiencing now differently from the person sitting next to you, not just because you have a different visual perspective or a different auditory perspective, but because you came into the room with different experiences. And after this is over, what happens subsequent to this hour will change what you remember about this hour. So this is a tremendously dynamic thing, except much of what happens when we create experiences in school fails to acknowledge that very reality about people. I'll show you another picture that's sort of interesting, and many of you have probably seen this too. I stole this off the web of the Human Connectome project. And of course, this is a picture of the pathways of axons in a brain. And of course, the real issue about what happens when brains learn is not where memories get put, but are they connected in advantageous ways that makes them advantageously retrievable in the future. So when I talk to teachers, and I talk to people who are musicians who are trying to learn about teaching more effectively and learning more effectively, one of the things that has to change is their conception of memory as something that's unitary, that gets put in a place that then you recall at some later point in time. And that's so well fixed in schools, and it's so well fixed even in music learning, that often it fails to advantage students who could actually learn more than we think they're capable of based on what their behavior is and the circumstances we provide for them. I'm going to show you a little video clip of something that the University of Texas used to play. You know, we have a huge football program at Texas, and all Division I schools have little 10, 15-second clips that we play during television appearances of our team to show how cool the team is. And so I'm going to play a little clip that we used to play about 15 years ago.
We don't claim to be able to change the world. We just change people. And then they change the world. We're Texas.
Now, come on, who doesn't want to go to school there? I mean, you got Walter Cronkite's voice, got steel guitar, got breakfast tacos, it's fantastic. Now, I love the audacity of that, I mean, which is sort of is emblematic of the way Texans feel about themselves. You know, we're Texas, we just change people. And when that video was playing, which is now 12 to 15 years ago, the then provost and then president, whenever I'd find myself at a gathering with them, I'd go up to them and say, you know that ad we're playing on television, we just change people? How do we know that? And of course, the real answer is we don't have any idea. And how do we know we're actually changing them the way we're intending to change them? Well, we don't have any idea about that either, right? Because we bring people into rooms and we do stuff to them and with them and send them on their way with the expectation that they've been changed in some way that we've intended, when that's often not the case. So that raises the question, what do we do about that? And it has to start, I think, with this. And now I'm thinking about this particular to music. My favorite phrase that I think I composed is this one at the top. That any learning experience, whatever it happens to be, needs to begin with a vivid vision of students as accomplished learners, and in this case, as accomplished musicians. And what I'm thinking about in this is once we're finished with learners and they're finished with us, what do we want them to be like? Now, I choose my verbs carefully, and I don't want, I'm not using the phrase that happens in a lot of curricula that says, what do we want them to know and be able to do? But what do we want them to be like? And the reason I describe it that way is that being competent in any discipline has not only intellectual components and physical components, perhaps, but it has an attitudinal component as well, too, right? I mean, being successful as a musician, as a bench scientist, as a writer, requires not only knowing things and being able to do things, but having a productive attitude in that discipline. If you aspire to be a bench scientist and anytime you set up an experiment and it doesn't work, you want to start throwing stuff across the room, you're not going to be a very successful bench scientist, right? Because most experiments don't work. So there's an attitude part to this that's required as well. And I had the great privilege, which many of you did too, some of you did not. Previous to my talk tonight, we had a wonderful workshop where I learned a great deal from colleagues who have done just really remarkable research. And one of the things we were talking about during those discussions, right, is this issue of setting up people attitudinally to be effective learners, which requires something other than what often happens in school. Now, I want to think back to the kid playing the ukulele again, because one of the things that impresses me so much about his performance is the expressivity in what he's doing, right? And I thought about, when you look at great musicians being great musicians, what is the stuff that they're actually doing when they're being great musicians? And I wrote it down, and that's the whole list. Now, what's remarkable to me is how few things are on that slide, right? And with the exception of tone production, which does require a little development of muscular control and coordination and sometimes strength in some cases, none of those things is even very hard, right? The hard thing about all of that is doing all those things at the same time, right? And all of this is directed toward making this thing happen. Now, I want to relate this idea to what I was saying a moment ago about how music experiences in school are often unlike what happens outside of school, and not just in music, in the sciences as well. I've been working on a grant that's funded by National Science Foundation for a number of years where we have a group of PhD students who are given fellowships to be scientists for a day in residence in schools for a whole semester. So these students go into schools every Friday, whatever it happens to be. They talk to students about their own research. They help students set up their research. It's a really wonderful program, and I'm privileged to be a part of it. A number of years ago, when we first started this program, and we really didn't know what we were doing and didn't know how best to set this up, it was a very bright woman in my class who was asked by her teacher to do a lesson on friction, and she was a geophysicist. And she said, okay, and rather than designing her own lesson plan, the teacher sort of gave her this lesson plan about friction. And in the Austin School District, you can actually rent a set of friction kits, unfortunately. And basically what the kits are for schools is they're 50-centimeter boards that have foam on one side and smooth wood on the other side and a bunch of really heavy metal washers and digital stopwatches. And what this teacher had done was set up these boards, had all the kids make inclined planes, and they're supposed to slide these washers down the boards and time how fast the washers go on the foam side and the wood side. And you know where this is going. This is a 7th grade class, right? So my nice student who's doing this, and they're videotaping this whole presentation, says, we're going to talk about friction today. So if you were pushing a 50-pound block of cement, and you had to push it 100 yards, would you rather push it across a football field or an ice skating rink? These are seventh graders, right? They say, ice skating rink. And I saw her look on her face on the videotape. She kind of went ashen, like, you already know that? We're doing friction today. I'm supposed to teach you that. So anyway, they knew that already. She goes through, she asks them a couple questions about going down a playground slide with shorts and long pants on to see, which would be more advantageous. And she's talking about these things. She sends them off to do the experiment. All the kids have their incline plane. They're sliding their washers, pushing the stopwatches. The camera's going around to the kids, and the kids look very disengaged in this, and like they slide the washers up, you go 0.18, and the kid would write it down. Because, of course, everybody knows what the answer is going to be, right? Now, for a lot of people, that's an experiment. But for the kids, it wasn't an experiment because they know the smooth side is faster than the foam side, so there wasn't really anything to find out in doing that, right? And there was no look on any kid's face that led me to think that they're thinking, so this is why people love science, right? Nobody saw that as the fascination in this thing. And I asked the teacher to consider, I said, well, I wonder, there are questions that I don't really know the answer to about this problem. I mean, for example, what does the angle of the plane have to do with how fast the washers go on each side? Because, of course, when the board's lying flat, if you put the washer on one side, it's not going to go anywhere. And if you stand it up on its end, they're both going to go the same speed no matter what side is facing the washer. So when does that change? And how does this change proportionally relative to the angle of the board? Now, I don't know the answer to that. Teachers didn't know the answer to that either, right? Now, that's worth an experiment. But on our campus, and maybe here true at McGill too, a lot of freshmen come in and take lab classes in the sciences, and they'll take a chemistry lab and they'll do something that's called an experiment, but the water has to turn blue for you to get credit, right? Now, that's not an experiment, that's a recipe, right? And if our goal is to teach people to think scientifically, right, one of the things that requires is having them actually create questions and then collect data in a way that allows them to answer the questions, right? Which is a different way of thinking about learning. So whether we're talking about sciences, writing, music making, whatever, the point of music making, express something to other human beings. Now, if my goal is to play the cello and I want to play this lovely languid piece for somebody, now I have a reason to learn to cross strings without making bumps in my sound. I have a reason to shift without hearing the shift, because now the goal is an expressive one, and it has to do with a listener and not with what I'm doing physically. Now, that's a very different way of thinking about the way we present music learning to children and to adults, too, for that matter. There's a colleague of mine who teaches at Texas Tech named William Westney, and he wrote a wonderful book about learning music called The Perfect Wrong Note. And one of the things that I saw Bill do, he's a great pianist, at a workshop one time. He was working with these very advanced pianists, these lovely players. And he had them play, and they all played whatever pieces they were playing for this little master class. And he had one of the students come stand at the end of the piano, facing another student who was sitting at the piano to play. And Bill said to this person, now play to him. And I couldn't believe how much his playing changed, right? Because now, all of a sudden, he was playing to somebody. Now, this is true in every aspect of what people do in school. I'll give another example of that. When I first went to Texas, I had a doctoral student, very bright woman, a terrific pianist, lovely teacher, not a particularly skillful writer. And I was struggling to try and get her to write better, and she was struggling too, and we were both very frustrated, and it was a tough thing to do. And I don't know what made me think of this, but one Friday afternoon, I said, here's what I'd like you to do. Go home this weekend. This is before email and before I'm that old. Go home and write a letter to your mother about this project that you're working on. Bring it back to me on Monday. And she came back on Monday with this letter that she had written to her mother about this project she was working on. It was the best writing of hers I'd ever seen. Now, you could say, well, it's her mother. And no, actually, that was the first time that she was writing to someone, right? That the idea is now I'm writing with a reader in mind. So I have to think about, what does my mother already understand about that? What do I need to explain to her? What questions might she have when she gets to this part in my explanation that I can anticipate and write? And now writing becomes an entirely different enterprise that many students in college don't experience, right? If you're in a musicology class and your professor wrote the definitive text on lay quartets of Beethoven, and your assignment is to write a paper on the Grosse Fuge, who are you writing to, right? And so what many college students do, you gather as much information as you can and stuff it in the paper, hoping that when your professor reads it, she'll find what she's looking for somewhere in the paper and give you a good grade, which is not what writing is about, right? It's about conveying things to other human beings. If we look at what has now been studied in terms of how we get people to practice and play more effectively, these are the things that in domains in and out of music have been looked at over time to think about how musicians actually learn effectively. And again, this has been studied not only in music, but outside of music as well. And by focus of attention, I mean, where are people directing their listening attention, their visual attention, their physical attention? What are they thinking about when they're singing or playing? Observation of a model has also been studied to some extent about how the effect that has on music learners. Variability of practice has been studied a great deal outside of music, less so in music. Feedback, focus, and frequency. Again, when teachers are working with learners, what feedback is doing, of course, is helping learners decide where their attention should go, what kind of auditory discriminations and physical discriminations that they should be making, and physical guidance. I'm going to show you about a couple of studies that I've done with some colleagues of mine, and I'll sort of take you through them relatively quickly to tell you about what kinds of things that we're trying to work on to figure out how these things can be applied in a music context effectively. We know from Gabby Wolf and colleagues and a number of people who've been working, Charlie Shea, who've been working on focus of attention and motor behavior, that as learners gain skill, and all of us develop through our lives just learning to use our bodies effectively, one thing that we know pretty clearly is that when you focus attention on aspects of your body that have become highly automatized, you actually interfere with the behavior. You actually interfere with the automaticity in a way that is solved when you focus attention on the effects of your movements rather than the movements themselves. There's some interesting work that's been done at the University of Chicago by Sean Bylock and several others that have looked at what happens when learners, when doers are focusing on different aspects of their behavior. One of the things that we know, and this has been done, for example, there's a very old study that was done with a little transducer where people had a hand exercise spring, and learners were asked to squeeze the spring and think about what they're doing with their fingers versus thinking about what is happening to the force that's being applied to the spring. All of us know when we're just thinking about how our bodies move, I can pick up this remote very easily without even thinking about it. I don't even have to look. But if I start to give attention to what my fingers are doing and what my hand's doing, I actually interfere with the fluidity of the movement, which has now become highly automatized. So one of the things that we're interested in about music making, and I refer back to the kid who was playing at the very beginning, what should music learners be thinking about? What should they be focusing on when they're learning to play an instrument, when they're learning to sing? You know, whenever I see people in a beginning wind class, and even beyond that sometimes, I see people breathing in a way that's very ineffective, which is odd to me. I mean, we've been breathing all of our lives, and the only time I would ever see somebody breathe like that is somebody who's been taught how to breathe in a music class. Right? Now, it's interesting to me when you go into a beginning wind class and someone comes into the class and somebody says, well, now we're going to learn how to breathe. Well, wait a minute, I've been breathing all my life. Well, once I start giving attention to the things that I'm doing with my body, I'm liable to do things now that are less effective than I would be doing if I were using the automatic processes that I've developed over years of experience. And, you know, for me, just a little bit of a personal experience here. When I first started teaching, I had a job teaching band and orchestra in Atlanta, Georgia. It was a wonderful job. I loved every period that I taught except third period, which was a class called Beginning Band. And it was misnamed because there wasn't anything beginning about any of those children. Excuse me, I just misspoke. It was called Intermediate Band. There wasn't anything intermediate about those children except they'd all owned their instruments for a year, right? So I had these students in this class. They'd been playing for a year. They couldn't do much of anything. Just to give you an idea of what these students were like, I had a flute player who'd been playing for a year. She could play G to C in the first octave, and her position looked something like that, which even if you hadn't had a flute class, you know that's bad. I had a trumpet player who played notes that were so short, if you were looking away, you wouldn't know what was making that sound. You know, the sounds would kind of go, ah, ah, like that. Sometimes I'd be given I'd be working with the clarinets or something, and Tim would play a note. I'd look at the intercom. I thought the principal was calling me, but it was Tim playing a note. It was a kid playing trombone for a year who no one ever told him about using his tongue to articulate. So he played very portamento all the time. So I was teaching this class, and I found that as the school year was going on, I was giving them more and more time at the end of the period to put their instruments away. And by October, I was up to about 20 minutes of swabbing and drying. And at that time, this tenor sax player, who almost every day he would come up to me at the beginning of class, and he was always out of breath, because junior high kids are always out of breath. In order to go, Mr. Duke, are we going to play today? Just hoping I'm going to say, no, we're going to read a book. Yes, it's band. Get your instrument, for God's sake. So anyway, they get out and do this thing. So Tim goes back to the instrument room, and I hear him in the back playing Louie Louie on his tenor saxophone. So back in the back of the room, Tim's playing, fwah, 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 fwah. Not the melody, just the bass part, right? Over and over again. And Tim goes back in the room, and I'm sort of standing outside the door, eavesdropping, and Tim goes, hey man, what are you playing? Now, if these instruments had not been in the same transposition, I would be an attorney. So he said, well, I don't know, let me see, F, yeah, I think the first note's F. So he teaches him how to play Louie Louie, the bass part, on the trumpet. So two of them are in there playing together. Fwah, 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 fwah. So they're just over and over again. Pianists have heart and soul, tenor saxophone players have Louie Louie. So anyway, so the bell rings, everybody else is leaving. They're still in there playing. I had to make them stop and put their horns away and go to class. Now, I'm a one trial learner, so I went home that night, I wrote out Louie Louie for the whole class. Not the melody, just the bass part. And the next day, I taught more in that class period than I taught in the 6 weeks leading up to that, right? I taught the nice trombone player who's desperately trying to re-articulate those three notes without using his tongue, going, ooh, 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 ooh. If you put your tongue in front of the note, you'd hear notes, Larry, it'd be really nice. And Tim, I got him to open his teeth so like air would go into the trumpet, you'd hear like a tone, and everything. Now, the thing is, the next day when they came back, of course, the tenor sax player didn't come up and say, are we going to play today? You know what I'm going to say, right? He said, will you play Louie Louie today? And I was trying to be cool. I said, well, I don't know, get your instruments. Well, of course we are, good God. So when they all came back, about halfway into that second day, the tenor saxophone player who started all this raised his hand and says, hey, Mr. Duke, what notes are you playing? Now, that was the first time anyone in that room had any interest in learning something that I had to teach. Because what I was trying to do is teach them to play their instruments. And they had signed up for the class with the bizarre expectation that they were going to make music every day, right? Now, I would tell you, the book that I was teaching out of, blissfully, is no longer in print. It was called Master Method for a Band. And actually, it should be called Taskmaster Method for a Band. And when you open the book at the beginning, there's a page of concert B-flat whole notes and whole rests in different configurations. So like, there's a whole note and a whole rest and a whole note and a whole rest. Next time, one whole note and two whole rests and then a whole note. This goes on for a page, right? So you have rooms full of children going, rest, 2, 3, 4. This goes on for pages like that, right? Line 8 had all whole rests just to be sure you're paying attention, right? And then you get to the next page, then all history of concert B flat and concert C. So this goes on for pages like this, right? Now, I can't imagine somebody who's in that class, right, sitting at the bus stop with their trumpet case and having a friend say, what is that? Is that a trumpet? Yeah, well, take it out and play something for me. Okay, I will. But, no kid's going to say, is it too late to sign up? Maybe I could get in there. I don't know. Now, again, the reason I'm saying all this, it really has to do with memory formation and learning, right? Because when we understand something deeply, whatever the thing happens to be, the depth of that understanding provides a framework for all the things that we learn about related to that thing, right? My students will hear me give a lecture for an hour, no notes, and I'm calling references out of the air. And someone comes to me and says, Dr. Duke, I don't know how you remember all that stuff. I couldn't possibly remember all that stuff. And my response to them is, you're absolutely right. You couldn't possibly remember all that stuff. But that has nothing to do with the inherent limitations of your memory store, right? The reason I can remember this stuff and you can't right now, yet, is that my memory is organized entirely differently than yours. And if, in fact, we organize memory around what are the fundamental principles of the discipline, whatever the discipline is, and that's what's on the front of people's thinking all the way through the process of learning, we change the way learners function. Now, again, this is not a music thing, this is a school thing. It has to do with mathematics, it has to do with languages, it has to do with history, it has to do with everything, right? Because typically, the mistake that we make is that people come to school being generally incapable of doing what we're going to teach them how to do, and we need to get them ready to get to the good stuff, right? And in all that getting ready time, what they're learning is a way of thinking about the subject matter and the way of behaving in the subject matter that will actually keep them from being fluent and successful in the future. Now, I understand this because anybody who's a caring teacher who wants to sort of help people get better thinks, well, I want to set you up so carefully that you're not going to make many mistakes. And I went to school as an undergraduate in a very behaviorally oriented teacher preparation program, right? And I got very good at setting up people so carefully that I could almost obviate error in learners. I certainly reduced the error rate to a very, very small size. But the problem with that is that all of us who learn anything in a natural environment learn through a process of error making and error correcting on our own. And the question you have to ask in school, when are there opportunities for that? And I'm sort of changing what I was going to talk about today in reference to the talk that we had in the past couple hours at the workshop to say this, error making is an essential part of learning anything deeply. And in school, when we try to take something that's complicated and messy and we systematize it, what we often obviate is opportunities to make errors that then inform a learner about how they need to think and what they need to know and what they need to do. Often I'll see a kid on a tricycle, or not a tricycle, a bicycle with training wheels, and see the training wheels set wrong, right? And what I mean by that is the training wheels are set so all three wheels, the bicycle wheel and the two training wheels, are touching the ground at the same time. Now, that's not how training wheels need to be set up. And why is that? Because when they're set up like that, the kid on the bicycle gets no information about the position of his body and what it does to the bicycle, right? Because if I'm set up so carefully that no matter what I do, the bicycle is going to remain upright, well, I'm not learning anything about the bicycle, right? And if the training wheels are off the ground by a couple inches on either side, now I notice that when I do this, the bicycle goes that way. So I make an error that I can correct, but it's not a catastrophic error, right? I'm going to tip over, but I won't tip over all the way to where I hit the ground. And learning experiences need to look like that, right? There need to be sufficient opportunities to make errors that are not catastrophic. And most of the time when we set up learning experiences for learners in school, that's not the way we create them, right? We set them up in a way where there are few opportunities to do things that matter a lot. And if I were to characterize most experiences in colleges, that the assessment opportunities for learners are low in frequency and high in magnitude. They don't happen very often, and when they happen, they matter a ton. And in order to get good at something, whatever the something happens to be, that has to flip, right? There have to be many opportunities to try and make mistakes and self-correct in a way that changes the way your memory works. Because in order to do that effectively, right, you have to be in a situation where error making is not daunting in terms of attitude, right? I mean, I often put up a slide. I won't put up a slide today, but I'll tell you about it today. I ask people to solve a simple division problem by fractions. So I put up a slide that has 1/2 divided by 3/4 equals, and I ask people to raise their hand and answer the question, right? And what's interesting to me, when I put up that slide and I look out a room full of highly educated people, I say, someone raise your hand and answer that question. And almost nobody raises their hand. And at Texas, I often give the opening talk on teaching for the new faculty seminars. And I put that slide up, and I got a bunch of PhDs in the room and people with terminal degrees and faculty positions somewhere else when they transferred to Texas. I say, okay, somebody raise your hand and tell me what the answer is. Nobody raised their hand except 5 guys from the math department. And it's a problem that's taught in 4th grade. And I asked my colleagues to consider, why aren't you raising your hand, right? And the answer is the same reason your students don't raise their hand when you ask a question. Because what if I was wrong? What if it's a trick? What if I raised my hand, you called on me, I said the wrong answer, then what? Well, then nothing, right? But we've been in school long enough that we've taken this sort of open, pick me, I'll try, I don't know what I'm doing, and become that, right? Also, during that first year teaching, there was an elementary school adjacent to my campus, and 2 days a week I would go over and teach the elementary children, the K&1 kids, music, because there wasn't enough hours of music teacher time for the regular music teacher. And whenever I'd be around those children, those of you who get to be around very young children know how delightful they are. I would pose a question and say, someone raise your hand, and just ask them, oh, and everybody's hand went up. They didn't care. Pick me, I'll try. They didn't know I was going to ask. And now I sit in a doctoral seminar and say, I'd like someone for talk just a minute, and everybody looks at the table. And I'm thinking, what happened to you? What took that bright, open, with it, pick me, I'll try, and turned you into that? And the only common variable that I can see ran through all their past experiences, they all went to school. And what school shaped very inadvertently, very effectively, very systematically, is an avoidance of situations where there is likely to be error making. And everything that we learn in life outside of school that we learn effectively is full of error making. You watch a little infant learning to ambulate, right? And they're falling down all the time, right? They're tipping over. They're not getting what they want. And yet, as they get more and more skillful in moving and grasping and doing all the things that little children do, right? They're doing that because their behavior is highly goal-directed and it's fraught with error. And if you imagine that, creating those kinds of experiences in schools where the behavior that we're asking students to do has clear goals that are related to a realistic outcome, whether it's music making, whether it's solving a problem, whether it's gathering some data to answer a question, whatever we're doing with that, creating it in such a way that learners have opportunities to try and fail and self-correct. Because without that, it's really impossible to learn effectively. Now, you might say, for all of us who are in here who went through a typical educational experience, you might say, well, we went through something like this where I sat in rooms like this for many hours, and I turned out great, so what's the problem, right? And of course, the problem is all of us in this room who have been really successful did much more than was asked of us when we were sitting in these rooms, right? We actually left the room and talked about some problem that we didn't understand that happened during the lecture. Or we would get together and do something on our own that was not assigned to us. But many students who come to school don't do that, right? For whatever reason. And so it's incumbent on us, I think, to create experiences in the classroom that actually make it more likely that that kind of thing is going to happen. I just want to look at my time here because I want to be sure I leave time for questions. I think rather than get into a whole different train of thought, I think I'm going to stop here and ask whether there are questions and we could have a discussion about what I'm going to talk about. But anyway, let me thank you on a late Thursday afternoon before Good Friday for coming and listening to me talk today. Thanks a lot. Thank you.